the questions everyone asked, because I did set decorate Star Wars and I got an Academy Award for it, and everyone thinks, oh, Star Wars, this huge universe. We made that film for no money. There was no interest at the time, box office wise, in science fiction. So there was no money to be made by the studios, and American culture was incredibly dead in Britain at the time. So here was a young American director with a children's fantasy that was science fiction. He had no ticks going for him. And I'd met George in Mexico. They flew down to meet the designer and I. We were putting up very dusty 1920s sets, and we were using old Mexican locations to make a kind of rum-running film, and that's exactly what George was after for the look. So we spoke. I said that I think science fiction has never connected to an audience so far, and I believe that it should be more real. And George said, that's what I'm trying to make. I don't want any emphasis on special effects. I don't want it on the weapons, on the sets, nothing. I want it all to be a real world. So John and I got hired, and another art director, Les Dilly, and I spent 4 months with George in London, just 6 of us in a tiny studio working out how to make this film with no money. And I keep emphasizing that. I had literally no budget to make anything. So I went and got guns, real guns, and adapted stock pieces on them, and George loved them. And I made the lightsaber. This is Luke's lightsaber, the original ones, which I made for about $12 from an old camera flash part, stuck T-strip that I stuck on a stormtrooper's blaster.
That's incredible.
This is a bit of a calculator that came from the bubble strip, which used to magnify the numbers. So for about $12, I created probably the most iconic prop that's ever been in cinema today. So all of this builds up to the point that George made that film. We had $4 million to start with, and I stuck by his side because this is a world I believed in, and I always have. And I'm, you know, jumping ahead, I love huge blockbusters, and I love Iron Man and Superman and Blonde Man and Green Man and Blue Man and whatever they have in the cinemas, and you get a huge experience out of it. But it comes and you watch and you go, wow, what's the next one? There's a reason why Star Wars has maintained a place in history.
Interesting.
And that first one that was made for very little money, like an old little dusty Western. It was made like an old Sergio Leone movie, and I know all of you will know his movies. And they had a kind of, I don't know, it always gripped me, the reality of them all. This was real. There's nothing wrong in CGI. I love it, and the toy box is open, I call it now. We can do absolutely anything, and even as I speak now, the new Planet of the Apes is coming. They've even got expressions. Everyone's saying, here, it's broken the barriers. That's all very well and good, but there's a certain inner belief in human beings. When you're watching a guy flying around buildings, you know that's actually doesn't work. It's not actually true. Star Wars took people into a world, and it was based on something which I'll talk about, which is the most important thing about making films, is the story. And George studied a great deal about legend and myth, and George kind of created the perfect myth, which is why the world's embraced it. So doing Star Wars kind of set me up, and the way George works. George was a student director, and he still is. That's the way he worked. There was very, very smallish crew. We struggled kind of in the dirt. He made it like a European director. He made it as if he was making THX. It was a struggle for him because the lighting cameraman was old school and didn't believe George should even look through a camera or anything. It was a huge clash of the old guard and the new world coming in. And I think that when I look at what films that, you know, stick into the consciousness, they're all kind of a struggle that have been made, and they're all made in a way that the belief of the filmmaker was so strong that they pulled it through, and somehow that DNA shows on the screen. It does to me anyway. You know, moving on, like Alien is another one that's like, in these two films have become cinema kind of legends. Alien also was way under budgeted. It was made as in the same lack of confidence in the studio as Star Wars. Alien was the first R-rated science fiction film ever that was a big studio film. So I know when I came on board to do all the sets for Ridley, and I created the Nostromo and all the interiors, the budget was like $6 million, where you take part of that for the art department, it was nothing. So again, I was buying scrap aeroplanes, breaking them down, buying PVC drain pipes, sticking them in. I made the whole thing like that, and we created, I think for the first time ever in cinema, audiences never questioned that we weren't inside an old space truck.
Would you say, Roger, that it was in the end a blessing in disguise, these limitations of the budgets?
Yeah, where limitations work, and I'll tell you one story on the script of Star Wars. Obi-Wan Kenobi lived in a big complex of caves, and John Barry, the designer, took George down to Tunisia. He designed Little Prince, and as soon as George saw locations, there was the Tatooine that he'd imagined. In fact, Tatooine name came from that recce. It wasn't in the script. It was the name of a little tiny Tunisian town. George saw it, and when they came back, he realized they had to cut the costs, because the budget was $4 million. It was about $8 million in America. That Fox kept cutting it and cutting it. So what went? Obi-Wan's cave complex. It went down to a single cave dwelling that I had to dress. And I think that is actually better for the film, because he's a, if you like, he's a Buddhist master. He's a Jedi master, but he's like a Buddhist master. So he shouldn't have had a big complex. He should, you know, it worked for the better. And I think when you're up against it, you really, really try to find a way to make things work. As a director and as a filmmaker, it focuses your intention of what you really want up on that screen. This is something that is incredibly valuable. You know, I look at many other films that have been made in this way, and I think there's a kind of DNA graft that goes on the floor that gets through onto the screen, and I think audiences buy that as well. So, you know, an Alien has, obviously both these films have now gone on into universes. It's huge. I will point this up. I took 2 years off and I wrote this book, and it's all the stories about the real stories, because I get asked 100 times about making Star Wars and Alien and another film, Black Angel, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I did it blow by blow, but it's not a book of ego. It's not like, oh, I did this and I did this. What I wanted to do was be inspirational. And I'm going to read the last line of my book, which says, I have written this chapter because my last words to anyone aspiring to follow their dreams are truly more pertinent than ever. Do not let anyone tell you you can't. You can. Just have a dogged determination and never ever give up. So, and my most satisfying reviews, which have been 100% on this book, is people have said, wow, this is really inspiring. And I link this back to Star Wars in that Luke, we're all following a hero's journey. Luke needed Obi-Wan Kenobi as a master to guide him. We all need mentors. We all need guides. We all need that kind of assistance. I certainly came through without one, but I found one in John Box, and I found I found other people, even George himself, you know, because I've gone on with George. He commissioned my first short film as a director, as a thank you to what I did on Star Wars, and I've directed second unit for him on Return of the Jedi and on The Phantom Menace, and these were way bigger shoots, but even with all that success, they were still very tightly made. I remember Rick McCullum, the producer on Phantom Menace, said the film was $110 million budget. He had budgeted out doing it as an American studio movie, and it came out at $400 million. So they follow the mantra that I preach, which is what I call down and dirty.